So wonderful to have you all here this morning. So, as you heard, my name is Reverend Ken Reed Brown. I'm the minister here at First Parish in Hingham, which is a congregation that was gathered as a congregation in 1635, and then that built this meeting house in 1681. And I want to point out, this is not a virtual background. We have finally gotten Wi-Fi into our meeting house, and I'm speaking from a place right in front of the pulpit this afternoon. And of course, we still worship here, now virtually, but otherwise every Sunday in person. Old Ship, as it has been called only since sometime in the late 1800s, was the second meeting house for the town of Hingham. The first having been built not long after the English colonists arrived in 1635 in the land of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag peoples. And these were settlers that included early ancestors, as probably most of you know, of our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. And that first meeting house was situated just down the street, near where Nona's now is, and that whole row of stores. Well, by 1681, the town had outgrown the first meeting house, and after much discussion as to where to build their new one, they decided to build on this hillside where we, of course, now are. The land was owned by Joshua Hobart, the brother of the first minister, Peter Hobart, who died, Peter did, just before the meeting house was built. And interestingly, as some of you know, when I arrived at Old Ship in 1987, I discovered that not only am I, as the 20th minister here, Peter Hobart's successor, I'm also a direct descendant, along with thousands of others, given the passage of generations. But back to the building. Though it was among the largest meeting houses in New England at the time, the style of the meeting house was much like all the others, a roughly square, not quite, but roughly square, hip-roofed structure. This painting by Marty Saunders, a lot of you know Marty, I'm sure. She's a member of our congregation and lives in Hingham, now at Linden Ponds. She painted it to represent how it seems the meeting house may have looked, given what building conservators have discovered in recent years. You can see lots of differences from its current appearance. As we would all know, if time travelers from among those who built the meeting house were to suddenly find themselves standing in front of it, not only would they not recognize, of course, the roads and houses and so on around them, they would likely not even recognize the meeting house they had constructed with their own hands, since so much has changed. So we'll take another look. Looking from the outside, the early settlers wouldn't recognize the windows, which were larger, as you saw in Marty's painting, when the meeting house was built to let in plenty of light, or the paint on the clapboard siding, or the stone foundation. These were all later additions. The meeting house, as it now is bigger than it was originally. Another reason they may not have, they perhaps wouldn't recognize it as the building they had constructed. But once they walked inside and looked up, they would surely recognize the beams overhead that they had with remarkable effort put into place, along with the king posts rising. And trying to see, you can see just a little bit in one of those slides, the king posts rising from each cross beam and the curved trusses exerting upward pressure on the cross beams so that those cross beams would not sag. So from inside the church, we'll take a closer look. Those beams and the posts that supported the entire structure, tree-ring studies on a few of them have told us that some of the trees from which the beams were made were as old as 600 years. So the beams bring us back to a time when the only human inhabitants were the native peoples of New England. As we said, the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and many others. And each beam was fashioned from one tree. Think of the size the trees had to be. And the curved truss beams came from naturally curved tree trunks or limbs. And the beams and rafters of the roof structure do create the appearance, magnificent appearance of the inside of an old ship. Some have believed that this appearance gave rise to the nickname Old Ship. But the first references we have to Old Ship come, as I said, from the late 19th century, when the beams have been covered with a ceiling for over 100 years. So not many people were able to see that structure. Others believe the name that may have been given to the meeting house by ship captains who could see the steeple as a landmark as they approached Hingham Harbor, back in a time when the trees in the cemetery were either not there or not nearly as tall as they are now. Other coastal churches have similar nicknames. There's Old Brig in Dorchester, Old Sloop in Scituate. Whatever the origin, Old Ship Meeting House or Old Ship Church is what this old place is now most frequently called. And as for Meeting House, the Puritans who built it believed that the church was the community of believers, which for them was First Parish in Hingham, and was not any building. Indeed, New England meeting houses, including, of course, this one, were used not only for worship on Sundays, but for town meetings as well. You can see us assembled there in the gymnasium in one of the recent years. Hingham's town meeting was held here, though, in the meeting house until the late 18th century. Returning to the structure itself, the construction itself, the frame was raised on 3, no doubt, hot days in July. We've just had some pretty hot days in July, so imagine the work done on such days. And the meeting house was completed in time for town meetings and worship the following January. Everyone in town was assessed for the cost, which was £430, of course, British money. Clapboard inside and out, as you can see from the cutaway. No plaster on the inside walls or paint outside to begin with, and plain backless benches to sit on. I guess you fell asleep at your peril back in those days. Before the first meeting for worship, the town leaders drew up a careful seating chart. Men and women and older children separate with additional divisions according to age, marital status, and economic status. And here you see a chart for the 2 floors. When it was time for town meeting, as we know, only white men who owned property were permitted to vote. A toe in the door for democracy, as I often tell the 5th grade students who come through, better than the king telling you what to do, but a long way from democracy, of course, as we understand it today, which is still a work in progress in many ways. As we know, it wasn't until after the Civil War that African American men could vote, and not until 1920, 100 years ago this year, that women could vote. Democracy is always, as I've said, a work in progress, certainly visible this year. And this old meeting house has been here and stands here still as witness to the continuing evolution of American democracy. And that evolution of democracy has had to do not only with political rights and voting, but with religious freedom as well. As we know, those Puritan settlers came to these shores seeking religious freedom. But what they were seeking was religious freedom for them as a community of believers. It didn't mean for them that an individual could just believe whatever he or she chose to believe, to suddenly become a Buddhist or a Hindu or whatever else. No, it was a community of believers that was seeking religious freedom. And though Puritan theology and belief softened during the first century of settlement, First Parish in Hingham, worshiping here eventually, was the only congregation in Hingham until early in the 1700s, when at 2 different times, new parishes were gathered. First, in what is now Cohasset, there you see First Parish Cohasset, what was then Second Parish in Hingham, and now First Parish Cohasset, later in South Hingham, which was originally Third Parish in Hingham, and now is, as we know, the current Second Parish in Hingham. And I've been doing all I can to confuse you on this point. Will be tested later. In any case, those new congregations at the time were still Puritan, though, as I've said, less strict than at the outset of settlement. It wasn't until the early 1800s that other churches were formed in Hingham: Baptist, Methodist, Universalist, later in the century Episcopalian and Catholic, and this first parish became Unitarian. We'll talk a little more about New North later on. Well, by then, the United States Constitution, of course, affirmed freedom of religion as an individual right, not just collective right. And now, of course, in Hingham and in the United States, we have a huge variety of religions, and people are free to worship, as you know, in whatever way they choose, or not to worship, or belong to any religious tradition if they choose. At Thanksgiving, I imagine many of you have been to the service that we hold here as ministers and rabbis and other religious leaders from Hingham and Hull, representing many faiths, gather in this old ship meeting house to worship together in the spirit of religious freedom for all. This slide is from one of our Christmas Eve services, but on Thanksgiving Eve, it's almost as full with representatives of these many faiths. As for our first parish in Hingham, we are now Unitarian Universalist, as you can see from that slide. We welcome people in our faith tradition. We welcome people of diverse religious backgrounds and require no particular creedal statement. We gather in covenant. And together, like most religious communities, whatever our differences in belief, we seek to become better human beings, to help others in need, and to help make our nation and the world a more just and peaceful place. All this, though, begins to get me ahead of the story of the building itself, so we'll go back a bit. By the time of the American Revolution, which eventually led to enshrining all these and other rights in the Constitution, the meeting house had changed considerably. On two occasions during the 18th century, 1731 and 1755, wings, or additions, have been built, one on the cemetery side and one on the Main Street side. At the time of the second addition, the pulpit, which is behind me and you see in the slide, was built out of native pine, and the seating in the meeting house was reoriented. Originally, those plain benches faced a smaller pulpit on the cemetery northeast side of the meeting house, the slightly longer side at the time. But with the expansion, the longer side of the meeting house is now the northwest side, so the pulpit was placed there. This was the tradition of meeting house architecture, for the pulpit to be placed on the long side. Called a wine glass pulpit, you can see the shape at the bottom of the pulpit, which gives it that name. And like many pulpits of that era, it has a sounding board above the lectern so that the speaker's words could be reflected more fully out towards the congregation or meeting. It was, as you might say, our first sound system and the only sound system we had until about, well, almost 30 years ago. And it actually works pretty well, but if you're at all hard of hearing, not well enough. So we've upgraded since then. Now, a short distance to the left of the pulpit, to my right here, but to the left of the pulpit as you're looking at it, is a pew of Hingham's Revolutionary War general, as you know, Benjamin Lincoln and his family. It's indicated by a plaque on the inside door of the pew. You can see it in the other slide. Lincoln's pew, number 47, looks largely the same as it did when the Major General sat here with his family. And his home, as I expect all of you know, is right up the street near the statue of Abraham Lincoln across from New North Church and the old ordinary. And it was Lincoln, along with others, at the time who formed New North Church at the moment of a huge dispute, bitter dispute, having to do with the call of the next minister, also having to do with political matters, social class, very complicated, and I will let my colleague at New North speak more to that later on. It was contentious. We have resolved our differences. See, we're on screens nearby one another right now. Now also, beginning earlier in the same 18th century, the backless benches were slowly replaced by box pews. The first pews were around the outside perimeter, and they were built by subscription. Families purchased their pews. So whereas initially men and women and older children sat separately, as we said, now families sat together. And the wealthier, who were the first to purchase pews, now sat along the walls, not right up front. If you look closely, you'll see many familiar names. Some of you may descend from some of those names, but we all recognize street names that were given to those families' names: Whitten, Hersey, Cushing, Baxter, Beale, Levitt, on it goes. Lots of Levitts and lots of Lincolns and so on. Now, one more significant change had occurred by the time of the Revolution. A ceiling was installed. I mentioned that briefly earlier, covering the magnificent beams and helping to keep the building a little warmer in the cold weather. Foot warmers, those boxes that people brought from home filled with hot embers, were also still in use until the first stoves were installed early in the 19th century. I think it was 1825. As for the Revolution itself, as you know, most towns were somewhat divided between patriots and loyalists. This was true in Hingham. Indeed, Reverend Ebenezer Gay, who'd been the minister since 1718 and was still the minister at the time of the Declaration of Independence, of course in 1776, was himself a loyalist. And the way I understand his story is that it wasn't that he didn't sympathize with the grievances that the colonists had towards the crown, but he believed in the importance of social order. He didn't think that war was the way to make change. In any case, I expected that the Declaration of Independence, as it circulated through the colonies, was read from this pulpit, most likely not read by Reverend Ebenezer Gay. Now, in spite of this division in the parish and his being a loyalist, he lived for about 9 years after the Revolution, dying in his home on North Street at the age of 90, we're told, on a Sunday morning before church. Now, a few years after Gay's death, the town voted to tear down the meeting house, this building, as it was in need of many expensive repairs, and to build a new, as they would have thought, modern church in its place. And not long after the vote, the town voted again, and this time to repair the old place instead. I'm guessing, and probably records could, if we look deeply enough, show this to be the case. They probably simply discovered that it would cost less to repair the meeting house than to build a new one. In any case, this is one of the many reasons we still have the Old Ship Meeting House today, and we can be grateful for it. Well, we can continue our journey through Old Ship Meeting House history by leaping ahead to the years immediately following the Civil War. Once again, the meeting house was in need of major repairs. It was still getting older. Now, Colonel Luther Stevenson, a member of the church, there he is, who had served in the war, came to a meeting, we're told, with a handful of weeds and wildflowers that he said had been growing in his pew. There had been no foundation when the meeting house was first built. Weeds, indeed, might have pushed their way through rotting floorboards. But whether the story is precisely true or not, Stevenson had made the point that the old wooden floor had to be replaced. Well, what to do? They decided to jack up the old building, as in this photograph, dig out a basement and build a stone foundation. To replace the floor, they of course had to take out the box pews. All this similar to work undertaken in the old ordinary up the street to place the historic old fort house on a new foundation. In any case, here at Old Ship, they used the opportunity to essentially, well, redecorate, and pretty dramatically at that, to make it look on the inside more like a church, as they thought of it, and less like a meeting house. And here you see it after the renovation with decorations for Christmas. You could name the changes as well as I. From the photograph, they'd installed curved bench pews, carpets on the floor, yellow print wallpaper. You can't make out the color, but that's what it is. And again, decorated for Christmas. They painted most of the woodwork white and the pulpit a dark mahogany color. They installed the first organ, which you saw in that other slide, up front near the pulpit. As far as that yellow print wallpaper goes, we still have a square of it. I can look at it at the back of the meeting house on the back wall. Well, let's take a minute to talk about music. We've mentioned the organ. To begin with, the Puritans sang from the Psalms in the Bible. A song leader, known as a precentor, would sing a line, and then the congregation would sing the same line together. And on they would go in that fashion. Eventually, they had psalm books from which to read, and they learned the tunes. They began to sing together, but still without the accompaniment of any instrument. The first instrument, you've been looking at it here in that slide, was called a church viol. In between a cello and string bass in size, as you can kind of make out from the slide. We still own it. We keep it in a safe, locked room for only occasional use. It has a beautiful tone, actually. Later on, a wind group formed to join the viol, but it wasn't until 1869 that they had an organ, as we've said. Well, we've had a few pipe organs since then, including our last one, which had been installed in the gallery, in the balcony, with pipes on either side of the organ keyboard. Well, the outer facade pipes are still there, but we now have a high-quality digital organ, custom made. It's played on a keyboard like any other organ. It's a 3-manual, for those of you who know organs, with I don't know how many stops, dozens and dozens of stops. But behind those facade pipes, instead of dozens more pipes, are dozens of speakers. Now we also have a grand piano. Here you see one in our parish house, but we've got one right over here to my right. And often our music includes other instruments, whether violins, trumpets, guitars, even now and then a banjo. Now, as long as we're talking about music, I'll mention one other musical instrument, that is the bell in the steeple. Each Sunday, an usher still rings the bell by pulling the rope that hangs, I can see it right in front of me, hangs at the front of the center aisle. This is Old Ship's 5th bell. Apparently bells don't last as long as sturdy old meeting houses, but this one's been ringing since 1822, so it's been doing pretty well, almost 200 years old. Well, the Old Ship Meeting House no longer looks as it did after that 1869 so-called Victorian period began. By 1930, some members of the church have been talking for a while about restoring Old Ship to its earlier appearance, but which earlier appearance would it be? Back to hard oak backless benches and no heat? No one considered that. Instead, what they did was to do away with most of the 1869 Victorian changes, curved pews, carpets, wallpaper, painted woodwork, and so on. They also removed the ceiling that had been in place by then for almost 200 years, once again revealing the splendid beams, king posts, and trusses. Then they replaced and reconstructed the box pews. About a third of the pew doors, and here and there a few pew walls, had been returned by families who'd owned their pews. So the wood of those doors, which we have, of course, in place, and walls, is darker and more worn, and the spindles turn, but we don't, of course, turn them. They're old and delicate. The work, this was the midst of the Depression. The work was financed by Eben Howard Gay. You'll recognize that name. He was a direct descendant of Reverend Ebenezer Gay. Well, we'll take a step back inside, take a look at the changes. When they were finished, they had recreated a meeting house that reflects the Puritan era, with the beams overhead, the 18th, 19th century box pews, along with modern touches they'd had for some time already, including electric lights and central heating. And you'll notice that even though the fancy decorations were gone, the pulpit largely remained the same, though without that mahogany stain. Well, we're not quite finished with the tour of the history of the building, though. About 25 years ago, we installed an actual sound system. I mentioned that in passing earlier, so that everyone could hear. And sometime after that, we added a wheelchair ramp and entrance, so the people of different physical abilities could all easily enter. And about 10 years ago, we undertook a major investigation and restoration of the meeting house. No changes in what you see, but some very interesting discoveries. Behind the pulpit, embedded in the wall, are original doors. They were uncovered for a while during the investigation and so on. Now they're covered again, but there they are in that slide. And as for the beams, the visible beams were discovered to be in good shape, strong as ever, but we needed to reinforce the beams in the attic with steel beams so that the meeting house will stand, we hope, for another 300 years. You can see that steel beam in the attic in that other slide. Well, let's take a step outside again and look at the new addition up close. At the top of the handicap ramp, we added a small addition, so that's one visible change from the outside. On the cemetery side to accommodate a restroom with a composting toilet, very up to date. So for some period of time, there had been a sort of outhouse in the basement. There's still the remnants. There had not been a real restroom for over the first 3 centuries of the meeting house's existence. Imagine that. Well, Old Ship Meeting House, an Old Ship Church, as most people call it, is a beautiful building, as we all know, as a piece of architecture. Also happens to be the oldest wooden church building in the entire United States in continuous use as a church, and is among the most significant examples in our country of this style of meeting house architecture. And for all these reasons, Old Ship is designated by the federal government as a National Historic Landmark. We can look at old pictures and see how much of Hingham has changed, but the Old Ship remains a recognizable feature of downtown Hingham to this day, as we know. By the way, in this photograph, the 19th century image, Reverend Joseph Richardson, that most controversial minister who was called at the beginning of that century, is among those pictured. Well, we'll step outside again. Given its age, simply being inside Old Ship offers the opportunity, as to say, we'll step inside again. Just being inside this building offers us the opportunity to imagine history, American history, in fresh ways, knowing as we do that this old ship meeting house has been standing on this hillside from close to the beginning of New England colonization by English settlers. Knowing too that the beams themselves take us back even further to a time when only Massachusetts and Wampanoag and other tribes lived on these shores and hunted in forests filled with trees, such as the ones that became these beams. Beams in place for all these centuries of our complex American history. Well, thanks for joining us this afternoon on this tour. Many of you have been inside before, I expect, well, I know for a fact, and those of you who have not, time will come when we can open to tours such as this with many folks, and you can come in person to experience the beauty of Old Ship and the sense of the span of American history that you can feel, I certainly feel, simply standing under these beams. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to New North Church from a virtual point of view. As Elizabeth said, I'm the Reverend Stephen Aucella, and it's my privilege to serve as the pastor here. We are an independent Christian congregation and have been independently minded pretty much since our founding. In today's presentation, we'll talk about the church's beginnings, its architecture, its role in the abolition movement before and during the Civil War, and we'll also talk a bit about what we're up to now. History teaches us that not everything is as it seems, and that is as true about New North's founding as it is anywhere else. We have clearly defined dates for certain early milestones in our story, but the reasons why we're here in the first place are at times murky. As you now know, New North split from the first parish church, now called the Old Ship, and it happened in this way. In early 1805, the Reverend Dr. Henry Ware left the pulpit at First Parish to accept a theology professorship at Harvard University, filling the Hollis Chair, where he subsequently helped form the Harvard Divinity School. At First Parish, a disagreement arose over the choice of the next pastor of the church. The disagreement turned into dissension, and finally on April 17th, 1806, a minority in the parish voted to leave First Parish to form their own congregation. You can find a timeline of these events on our website, and the full narrative can be found online at Yale University. Another reason for the split can be traced to the tension between Unitarian Congregationalists and Trinitarian Congregationalists. Unitarian Congregationalists were also called liberal Christians, and their views clash with the so-called religious old guard. So when Ware left to go to Harvard, the tension between these two groups came out into the open. A denominational split finally occurred in 1825 with the formation of the American Unitarian Association. And as it happened, New North's second and third pastors, Charles Brooks and Oliver Stearns respectively, were both Harvard Divinity School graduates. In 1806, Benjamin Lincoln and others petitioned the Massachusetts General Court to incorporate them into, quote, a society for the purpose of building a meeting house for public religious worship. And the act passed on February 27th, 1807. This corporation and body politic was called the New North Meeting House Corporation. Meetings were called at the Old Ordinary up the street, from Andrews, innkeeper, to elect officers and so on. This arrangement still exists. We hold 2 annual meetings, one for the church and one for the meeting house in which the congregation meets. From a copy of a diagram of the sanctuary showing the original pew holders, as you can see here, we know that the builders completed raising the house on October 25th, 1806. The most notable founder, then and now, was Major General Benjamin Lincoln, who lived in the house across Fountain Square, seen here. On February 13th, 1807, another act of the General Court incorporated a number of inhabitants of the North Parish into a religious society by the name of the Third Congregational Society. First services were held in February 1807, and before that, services were held at Derby Hall. My story connects to these events in this way. The conservative Calvinists at Harvard became alarmed by Ware's appointment, and some left to form Andover Theological Seminary in 1807, the forerunner to my alma mater, as Elizabeth mentioned, Andover Newton Theological School. For both Hingham and I, 1807 was a watershed year. So let's now take a look inside New North Church. What the Third Congregational Society built is rather singular. Though it is called a meeting house, it doesn't follow the meeting house style prevalent at the time. Early congregational meeting houses in New England were either square or rectangular, with the pulpit and entry door on opposite long walls of the rectangle. Many meeting houses still exist in New England, but the oldest of the so-called four-square style is the Old Ship. The Old South Meeting House in Boston qualifies, but it has been a museum since 1877. New North is an early example of a meeting house built in the so-called church style. The difference is that while meeting houses have their pulpit and main entry on opposite long walls, as you can see in this diagram here, church style houses of worship have them on the short walls of the rectangle. In both cases, the roof's ridge line visually connects the pulpit with the main entry. Our building is rather large for the period. It's built of heavy timber construction. Exterior bearing walls support long span wood trusses extending the full 50-foot width of the building. Truss members are held together with peg connections, as you can see in the photo on the right there. Minor interior posts are used only to assist in supporting the seating balconies. A massive floor beam runs down the center aisle from the pulpit to the entry, about 70 feet. The builder's ingenuity is evident everywhere, yet is mostly hidden from view. This period photo shows the balcony and the servant galleries. A clock tower and cupola rise above the front entry. The dome is supported by 8 columns, and the dome profile is reminiscent of 15th century Italian Renaissance designs. According to Bill Thayer, an architect interested in the building's preservation, the New North Meeting House represents a departure from conventional designs and construction methods. The building includes elements of the Greek temple form and makes use of a mathematical ratio known as the golden section, which established proportional guidelines to set major width and height dimensions. This design helped influence what has since become a traditional church form. Materially speaking, there have been no alterations to the building exterior since it was built. The pews are all original and made of unpainted pine. These are the oldest pews in Hingham, and each is marked with a numbered pew door. In the sanctuary itself, the current mahogany pulpit, shown in this photo, dates to the 1830s, 1836 actually. Other changes include the removal of one group of side pews to allow for the addition of a door leading to the parlor and ballroom, built in 1906, and you can see that on the left. This photo is one of my favorites. You can see 2 windows on either side. The window on the left is now a door, and those pews on that side have been removed. The first group in the front were removed in 1892, and the remainder were removed in 1906. On the right, the pew closest to the pulpit on our right-hand side was removed prior to 1859, A few other pews behind it, the next two were removed in 1892, along with the ones on the left, and the remainder are still there. Down the center aisle, the first pew on the left and the first pew on the right were both removed also in 1906, and this was all designed to gain some room and some access to the new area. Straight ahead in the photo, that table and that chair are still used today. That's our communion table. This photo dates back to at least 1892. And I say that because these pews are all still there. The side pews are still there. So that table and chair are over 128 years old. But what dominates the photo is that Trompe l'oeil painting. Everything you can see there is paint. We can see some electric wall lighting sconces sticking out, but what's behind the pulpit is just a painted scene. And I can't imagine what it would cost to replace that today. It boggles my mind. I know some Trompe l'oeil artists, and it ain't easy, and they paint on small scales. We can also see, following the length of the balconies and then going up, the stovepipes that were used to heat the building in the winter. And that's about all I can tell you about this. It's one of my favorite photos. Anyway, in the clock tower, which you can see here, the steeple is a square tower with a clock face on each side. Above this tower sits the dome and cupola, inside of which the church bell sits. The first bell was a Paul Revere original, and that bell was replaced in 1853 by a bell cast by Henry Hooper. And here it is today. That's on the left, that's Ross Hochstrasser, who renovated our clock and bell. And the photo on the right, I lifted from the Boston Globe. David is on the left and Ross is on the right, and they're inspecting the hands. Those clock faces are 6 feet wide, and they were completely redone as well. That was in 2017. The current clock, procured by private subscription, was installed in 1845. In 1889, Hingham Town Meeting voted to adopt any measure to take charge of running and keeping in repair the clocks on churches of South Hingham, Hingham Center, and on the New North Church, and other public clocks in town. The other public clock was installed in a school now occupied by dependable cleaners. And as I said, in 2017, the Hingham Historical Commission, in conjunction with the Community Preservation Committee, restored all 4 clocks. And an electronic silencer prevents chiming through the late night hours, but you can hear the bell chime at least as far away as Hingham Cemetery. Today, Derby Academy students still do their annual egg toss out of the cupola to see which designs protect their eggs the best. Roll the clip there, Michael. That, let me explain, that was a little sideways. But the Derby kids come down and they have this project where they take a milk carton and they build a structure inside with an egg in the middle. And the idea is to see whose design protects the egg the best. The eggs seldom win. And when they all come out here and watch their teachers toss them off the bell tower, it stops traffic. Let me tell you, you got to come down and see it someday. Here we see the servant galleries, and they are one feature of the sanctuary that most people want to see and know about. And it's important to note that these never served as slave galleries. In 1783, long before the meeting house was built, Massachusetts Chief Justice William Cushing of Scituate ruled that slavery was incompatible with the newly ratified Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. That's fair enough. Segregation, however, lingered, and we can see it at New North in the form of these galleries, which represent what we can call architectural segregation. There are 2 galleries, one for men and one for women, also a form of segregation. Sitting in them was akin to sitting in the uppermost reaches of the old Boston Garden, but without the obstructed view. Be warm and steamy in the summer, no doubt, but quite warm in the winter. Slavery and segregation permeate the early history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth Colony, but support for it was not widespread. John Adams, for example, when he was president, sent 2 warships in support of an anti-French slave revolt in Haiti in 1799. Adams became a hero of the anti-slavery movement when he defended a group of Mendi tribe members on the ship Amistad, which ran aground off Long Island in 1839. He won, and the Mendi went home as free men. In 1835, some Hingham women organized the Hingham Female Anti-Slavery Society, pledging to use all Christian and pacific means for the abolition of American slavery. This was at the Baptist church down the street. Abolitionist feelings in New England were not universal. William Lloyd Garrison, for example, a vocal publisher and abolitionist, was attacked by a mob at Faneuil Hall on October 21st, 1835. Organizations such as his New England Anti-Slavery Society posed a threat to those who had a financial interest in the slave trade, both in the North and in the South. Here at New North, when the Plymouth County Anti-Slavery Society voted against church segregation in 1841, Eliza, Katie, and Anna Thaxter invited their Black servant, Lucretia Leonard, shown here on the left, to come down from the gallery and join them in their pew with the support of their new pastor, the Reverend Oliver Stearns. Some parishioners threatened to leave, but the sisters held firm. Lucretia did join them and eventually outlived everyone in the room that day. When Leonard died in 1904, she was mourned as a town icon. She's buried in Hingham Cemetery next to the Thaxters. Lucretia had many children, and some of her descendants still live in the area. And this is all deep background for what happened in Hingham in 1844. On August 2nd, 1844, the largest anti-slavery picnic ever held in the United States, according to Hingham historian Martha Reardon Buick, occurred in Hingham's Tranquility Grove. This event celebrated the 10th anniversary of the end of slavery in the West Indies, and you can see a replica banner there in the center that was carried down to Tranquility Grove. Up to 10,000 people attended this event, including William Lloyd Garrison, shown on the left, Frederick Douglass, on the right here, the Reverend Oliver Stearns, the Reverend Sereno Howe from the First Baptist Church, and the Reverend John Russell from Second Parish Church, plus dozens of Hingham abolitionists. What is most notable for New North is that the day began with a procession forming on the front steps and in Fountain Square, which then moved down North Street to Steamboat Wharf to meet people coming from Boston, and then onto Tranquility Grove off Main Street. Banners, such as the one hanging there, were carried to the parade, in the parade to the Grove. In abolitionist history, this was a huge event and unique. Several other celebrations were held simultaneously in Massachusetts on August 1st, but it rained in Hingham that day, pushing our celebration to August 2nd, enabling Garrison and Douglass to participate, having come from Boston by steamship. New North's role in abolition continued into the Civil War period when Governor John Albion Andrew, a Hingham resident and a church member here, formed the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment. The regiment was celebrated in the 1889 film Glory and commemorated in the high-relief bronze monument by Augustus St. Gaudens on Beacon Street in Boston, facing the State House. And that's John Andrews' plaque that's in his pew here at New North. Throughout history, more often than not, New North's ministers have attended Harvard Divinity School at some point, and a good number, especially early on, were Unitarian Congregationalists and later simply Unitarians. The church closed for 10 years in 1960 when New North dissolved its connection with the Unitarian Universalist Association. It reopened in 1970 as an independent Protestant faith community that welcomes people of all religious traditions. In the years since 1970, we've called pastors from the Presbyterian and Baptist traditions and from the United Church of Christ. These days, we worship in a New England-style congregational manner. Along with most of Hingham, we celebrate Lincoln Day in February. The community has been blessed to have generations of direct descendants living in the Lincoln House across Fountain Square. In this photo on the left, Rose Beveridge Woodard and her husband Charles pose with an image of Rose's ancestor Ben at the family pew during the latest celebration. Even the Hingham militia showed up, and here in the photo on the right, Jerry Hazeltine, another Lincoln descendant, fastens a wreath to the pew. A parlor and a ballroom were added to the site in 1906. And I'd like to expand a bit on the parlor photo on the left. In the corner, directly ahead, the case clock was built by John Bailey II. And he learned clockmaking at a young age, and he trained a lot of apprentices, including Hingham's Joshua Wilder. This clock was presented to the New North Parish House in memory of Clara L. Barnes on March 9th, 1905. So just before the parlor was built. To the left and out of view, to the left of that window, we have two portraits which were donated by Rose and her brother Franklin Beveridge. They show Ben on the right and his wife Mary Cushing. And they're interesting photos of a couple who have lived a good life and a trying life. General Lincoln is shown shortly before his death in 1810, sitting by a window. And if you look closely, you can see the church in the background. So the two buildings kind of look at each other now. The parlor itself is used sometimes for winter services where we just light a fire in the fireplace. And today, as of this week, it's now serving as a first grade school, which, believe me, is a riot. Also in the parlor, we have an inscription above the fireplace, which comes from a poem called At the Fireside, and it was written by John Davis Long, also a New North member, who served as governor of Massachusetts between 1880 and 1883, and as Secretary of the Navy from 1897 to 1902. We have hosted lectures here. We had Reverend Ann Robertson come in to talk about the Bible, which makes sense. And Martha was in to talk about Tranquility Grove. And as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, we've hosted larger forums on immigration and drug overdose prevention. In our outreach ministries, we provide spiritual support on an occasional basis at Hope Beyond Hope House in Weymouth, which provides transitional housing for women recovering from drug and alcohol addiction. We support the Hingham Food Pantry with monthly food donations. You can view a video about the pantry on our website. And New North Church has for years supported two foundations aimed specifically at children and their education, namely the Child Fund and Hope Changes Everything. Also, our longtime fuel assistance program is still in place, although the need for this program has been quiet the past few years due to lower fuel prices and milder winters. And finally, we support Hingham Cares, a local organization dedicated to fostering a strong and inclusive community that promotes a healthy lifestyle and informed and responsible choices about drug and alcohol use, aimed primarily at middle school and high school students and their parents. We even celebrated a contact-free Palm Sunday from the front steps this year. and we continue to do that once a month in the sanctuary. Overall, we are a small but engaged congregation. Thank you for watching.